Hello, my lovely people. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Jen. If this is the first time that you are seeing me, I thank you so much for stopping by. My return subscribers, you guys are the best. Thank you. Do you know Senegal president finally has done the right thing? When he went to Nigeria to get permission to go, say that's where he will get all his advice. I was scared though. I was scared, my dear. I was scared for Senegal people. I said, the worst has happened. Oh, what is happening? And I made a video about it. Only for me to, while I was watching my stuff yesterday, I found out that Senegal president has joined the government that is working. Hey, God. Hey, Senegal president has finally joined Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso. Gee, this made me happy, man. So watch this video. It will tell you why they joined and what made them join, what they're about to do. So Burkina Faso, under the Senegal president, they are now together. So Senegal president is calling every African president to come and join them. Hey, God. So the Senegal president is here now with my big guy, the youngest president in the world. The 35 years, now he just turned 35. The 35-year-old man that is doing an amazing thing. Hey, God, this is the type of thing that we want in our land. This is the type of thing that makes me happy. And as far somebody even asked me, say, you be from Burkina Faso. Why are you always posting Burkina Faso president? Are you crazy? Are you crazy? When I see something good, I'm going to shine it, because guess what? I am the light, and the light will always shine where there's darkness. And that person that sent me that still said, I love the man too, but I'm just wondering why you always talk about him. Yeah, we talk about, it doesn't matter where you're from, we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about when somebody is doing good, we talk about it to let our people know that good governance, people will love you. When people got your back, there's nothing devil can do. His people got his back. His people they are protecting him with everything, every fiber in them. And anybody that tries to do any rubbish, they will come after you. That is, you will not even believe what will happen to you. So my people, just watch the video and see how and why he got into the business with the Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger business. Just watch. And when you finish watching, when you see a good thing, share it so others can get the good news. I love you all. Mwah! Thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.
Will the West ever let Africa unite? Africa has been vulnerable to exploitation because its countries haven't been able to work together. They've had trouble finding common ground, allowing the West to take advantage. But things are changing. Senegal's new leader has teamed up with Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso to stand up to Western influence. This means the West might not be as dominant anymore. But can they still keep their power? Let's find out. The political landscape in Africa is undergoing a seismic shift, with Senegal's new leader aligning with counterparts from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger in a persistent call for autonomy and sovereignty. This coalition, aimed at challenging Western dominance in the region, has set alarm bells ringing in Western capitals. Senegal's emergence as a champion of African self-determination marks a significant turning point in the continent's struggle for freedom from external influence. But what's Senegal's new political stance? Senegal, a nation renowned for its rich cultural heritage and vibrant democracy, has recently emerged as a focal point in Africa's quest for autonomy and self-determination. Under the leadership of a new charismatic leader, Senegal has embarked on a bold journey towards asserting its sovereignty and challenging external interference in its affairs. This newfound political stance has reverberated across the continent, inspiring similar movements in neighboring countries and sending shockwaves through Western capitals. At the heart of Senegal's new political stance lies a genuine belief in African solutions to African challenges. The days of relying on Western aid and intervention are over, replaced by a determination to chart a course that aligns with the interests and aspirations of the Senegalese people. This echoes a broader sentiment across the continent, where leaders increasingly reject the notion of Western superiority and advocate for a more equitable global order. Central to Senegal's push for autonomy is a commitment to reforming outdated systems and structures that have long hindered the country's development. This includes economic policies prioritizing the interests of foreign powers over those of the Senegalese people. One of the key areas of focus is monetary policy, which calls for a strategic exit from the CFA franc system, which many see as a relic of colonialism that perpetuates economic dependency on France. The push for economic reform is not just about breaking free from the shackles of neo-colonialism, but also about creating opportunities for growth and prosperity for all Senegalese citizens. Senegal's new leadership recognizes that true independence cannot be achieved without economic self-sufficiency, and is committed to implementing policies promoting entrepreneurship, innovation, and inclusive economic development. In addition to economic reform, Senegal's new political stance strongly opposes external interference in African affairs. This includes criticism of Western intervention, particularly by former colonial powers such as France, whose military presence in the region has long been a source of tension and resentment. The call for removing foreign military bases and renegotiating unequal treaties reflects a growing desire among African nations to assert their sovereignty and reclaim control of their destinies. Another key aspect of Senegal's new political stance is its emphasis on forging partnerships with other African nations based on mutual respect and solidarity. The recent alliance formed with Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger is a testament to Senegal's commitment to Pan-Africanism and the principle of African unity. By joining forces with neighboring countries, Senegal seeks to amplify its voice on the global stage and strengthen its position in negotiations with external powers. The implications of Senegal's new political stance extend far beyond the country's borders. The West's reaction to Senegal's assertiveness will be closely watched, as it could have far-reaching consequences for regional and global geopolitics. Western powers, accustomed to dictating terms to African nations, may find themselves on the defensive as African leaders increasingly assert their independence and demand equal treatment on the world stage. But what does unity among African nations show us? The unity of African nations has long been an elusive goal, hindered by historical divisions, external interference, and competing interests. However, recent developments in the Sahel region, particularly the formation of an alliance between Senegal, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, signal a newfound determination among African nations to stand together in the face of external pressures and challenges. A shared vision of African solutions to African challenges lies at the heart of this unity. For too long, African nations have been beholden to external powers whose interests often diverge from those of the continent's people. The alliance formed by Senegal and its neighbors represents a rejection of this status quo and a bold assertion of African agency and autonomy. The significance of this unity cannot be overstated. In a region plagued by instability, poverty, and insecurity, the solidarity demonstrated by Senegal, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger offers hope for a brighter future. By standing together, these nations are sending a powerful message to the rest of the world. Africa is not a passive bystander in global affairs, but a force to be reckoned with. One of the driving forces behind this newfound unity is a shared recognition of the importance of regional cooperation in addressing common challenges. From combating terrorism and organized crime to promoting economic development and social cohesion, the alliance between Senegal and its neighbors provides a platform for joint action and mutual support. The alliance also reflects a growing realization among African nations that their interests are best served by working together rather than competing against each other. By pooling their resources and expertise, Senegal, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger can achieve far more than they ever could individually. This spirit of collaboration is essential for overcoming the complex challenges facing the Sahel region and the continent. Furthermore, the unity of African nations serves as a powerful counterbalance to external interference and influence. For too long, African nations have been at the mercy of foreign powers, whose interventions often exacerbate existing tensions and conflicts. By standing together, Senegal and its neighbors are sending a clear message that Africa will no longer tolerate outside interference in its affairs. Formation of the alliance between Senegal, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger also highlights the importance of leadership in driving regional integration and cooperation. Senegal's new leader, in particular, has played a pivotal role in rallying support for the alliance and articulating a vision of African unity and solidarity. His bold leadership has inspired hope and confidence among his counterparts in the region, laying the foundation for a new era of cooperation and partnership. However, the road to African unity is not without its challenges. Historical divisions, ethnic tensions, and rivalries between neighboring states obstruct regional integration and cooperation. Furthermore, external powers, wary of losing their influence in the region, may seek to undermine the alliance and sow discord among its members. Despite these challenges, the unity of African nations offers a glimmer of hope in an otherwise uncertain world. By standing together, Senegal, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are not only advancing their interests but also laying the groundwork for a more prosperous, peaceful, and united Africa. As they embark on this journey together, they carry the hopes and aspirations of millions across the continent who yearn for a better future. For African unity, one important factor needed to be addressed: Western intervention. So, what perspective do these nations have now about Western intervention? Throughout history, Africa has been a battleground for competing interests and ambitions, with Western powers often seeking to exert influence and control over the continent. From the era of colonialism to the present day, African nations have borne the brunt of Western intervention, experiencing exploitation, oppression, and conflict as a result. In recent years, there has been a growing chorus of criticism against Western intervention in African affairs, with leaders and activists speaking out against what they see as a continuation of colonial-era practices under the guise of development assistance and humanitarian intervention. One of the primary criticisms against Western intervention in Africa is its tendency to prioritize the interests of external powers over those of African nations and their people. Whether through military intervention, economic exploitation, or political meddling, Western powers have often pursued their agendas at the expense of African sovereignty and self-determination. This has led to a deep sense of resentment and mistrust among African leaders and populations, who feel that their voices are being ignored and their agency undermined by external actors. A particularly contentious issue in recent years has been the presence of Western military forces in African countries, ostensibly to combat terrorism and stabilize conflict-ridden regions. While Western governments often justify their military interventions as necessary for maintaining peace and security, critics argue that these interventions have only served to exacerbate existing tensions and fuel further violence. In many cases, Western military operations have resulted in civilian casualties, displacement, and the erosion of basic rights and freedoms, further deepening the cycle of conflict and instability. Another aspect of Western intervention in Africa that has come under scrutiny is its role in perpetuating economic dependency and exploitation. For centuries, Western powers have plundered Africa's natural resources, extracting wealth and leaving behind a legacy of poverty and underdevelopment. Despite the rhetoric of aid and development assistance, many African nations continue to grapple with high levels of poverty, unemployment, and inequality, exacerbated by unfair trade practices and exploitative contracts imposed by Western corporations. Critics also point to the hypocrisy of Western governments and international organizations, which often espouse lofty ideals of democracy, human rights, and good governance, while turning a blind eye to their complicity in perpetuating injustice and oppression in Africa. From supporting authoritarian regimes to turning a blind eye to human rights abuses, Western powers have often prioritized their geopolitical interests over the well-being of African populations, undermining the very principles they claim to uphold. Moreover, Western intervention in Africa has been criticized for lacking long-term vision and sustainability. Too often, Western governments and international organizations adopt short-term piecemeal approaches to addressing complex challenges such as poverty, disease, and conflict, failing to address the root causes of these problems or engage meaningfully with local communities and institutions. This has led to a cycle of dependency and vulnerability, where African nations rely on external assistance rather than developing their capacity to address their challenges autonomously. In recent years, African leaders and activists have become increasingly vocal in their criticism of Western intervention, calling for a more balanced and equitable approach to engaging with the continent. This includes demands for greater transparency and accountability from Western governments and corporations operating in Africa, and calls for reparations and restitution for the historical injustices inflicted upon the continent. Furthermore, African nations increasingly recognize the importance of regional cooperation and solidarity in addressing common challenges and asserting their collective interests on the global stage. By standing together and speaking with one voice, African nations can better resist external pressure and influence and chart a course toward a more prosperous, peaceful, and self-reliant future. And what does the new unity think about economic reforms? Economic policy reform has emerged as a central tenet of Africa's quest for autonomy and self-determination. Across the continent, leaders and policymakers are increasingly recognizing the need to break free from the shackles of neo-colonialism and chart a new course toward economic development and prosperity. From calls for currency reform to demands for fair trade and investment practices, the push for economic policy reform is gaining momentum as African nations seek to assert their sovereignty and reclaim control of their economic destinies. One key area of focus for economic policy reform in Africa is the reform of monetary systems that perpetuate dependency and hinder economic growth. Many African countries still use currencies tied to former colonial powers, such as the CFA franc, which is pegged to the euro and controlled by the French treasury. Critics argue that these monetary arrangements limit the ability of African nations to pursue independent monetary policies and stifle economic development by favoring the interests of the former colonial powers over those of African citizens. In response to these concerns, there have been calls for a strategic exit from currency unions like the CFA franc and adoption of national currencies that better reflect African nations' economic realities and aspirations. Senegal's recent decision to withdraw from the CFA franc system and introduce a new national currency is a significant step towards reclaiming economic sovereignty and asserting control over monetary policy. Currency reform is not just about asserting sovereignty, but also about creating opportunities for economic growth and development. By adopting national currencies, African nations can pursue monetary policies tailored to their specific needs and priorities, rather than being dictated by external actors. This can help stimulate investment, promote export competitiveness, and mitigate the impact of external shocks on domestic economies. Another key aspect of economic policy reform in Africa is the promotion of fair trade and investment practices that prioritize the interests of African nations and their people. For too long, Africa has been a source of cheap labor and raw materials for the rest of the world, with little benefit to its citizens. The push for fair trade and investment practices seeks to rebalance this equation by ensuring that African nations receive fair compensation for their resources and labor, and have a greater say in the terms of trade and investment agreements. One of Africa's main obstacles to economic development is the persistence of unequal trade relations with the rest of the world. Despite the rhetoric of free trade and globalization, African nations face barriers to accessing international markets and suffer from unfair competition from subsidized goods and products. Economic policy reform aims to level the playing field by advocating for removing trade barriers, eliminating agricultural subsidies in the global north, and promoting fair trade practices that benefit all parties involved. Economic policy reform in Africa involves addressing external challenges and domestic barriers to growth and development. This includes improving infrastructure, strengthening institutions, and investing in education and skills development to build a strong and resilient economy that can compete in the global marketplace. Senegal's new leadership has prioritized these areas as part of its broader agenda for economic transformation and has committed to implementing policies that promote inclusive growth and sustainable development. Furthermore, economic policy reform in Africa must be accompanied by efforts to address the root causes of poverty and inequality, including land reform, access to credit, and social protection programs. By addressing these underlying structural issues, African nations can create an enabling environment for economic growth and development that benefits all segments of society, particularly the most vulnerable and marginalized. Ultimately, economic policy reform is about improving economic indicators and creating a better future for all Africans. By asserting sovereignty over monetary policy, promoting fair trade and investment practices, and addressing domestic barriers to growth and development, African nations can pave the path to prosperity and build a brighter, more sustainable future for future generations. As they continue to push for economic policy reform, African nations reclaim their rightful place on the global stage and shape the continent's future on their terms. One important issue to address was exploitation and future partnerships. If the nations are aligning, they must set rules for fair partnerships. So, how did they do it? Resource exploitation has long been a contentious issue in Africa, with Western powers and multinational corporations often accused of plundering the continent's natural wealth for their gain. From minerals and oil to agricultural land and water resources, Africa is rich in valuable resources that have attracted the attention of foreign investors seeking to profit from its abundance. However, the legacy of resource exploitation in Africa is environmental degradation, social upheaval, and economic dependency. This leads to calls for fair partnerships prioritizing the interests of African nations and their people. One of the main criticisms of resource exploitation in Africa is its unequal distribution of benefits and burdens. While foreign corporations reap enormous profits from extracting Africa's resources, local communities often bear the brunt of the negative impacts, including displacement, pollution, and loss of livelihoods. This imbalance in benefits and burdens is exacerbated by corrupt practices and a lack of transparency in resource governance, which allows foreign investors to exploit Africa's resources with little regard for the welfare of local communities or the long-term sustainability of the environment. In recent years, African nations have increasingly recognized the need to renegotiate resource contracts and establish fair partnerships with foreign investors. This includes demands for greater transparency and accountability in resource governance and mechanisms to ensure local communities benefit equitably from resource extraction. Senegal's new leadership has been at the forefront of this push, advocating for a more inclusive and sustainable approach to managing the country's natural resources. One of the key principles underlying fair partnerships in resource exploitation is the concept of resource nationalism, which asserts the rights of African nations to control and manage their natural resources for the benefit of their citizens. This includes increasing state ownership of strategic resources, imposing higher royalties and taxes on resource extraction, and establishing sovereign wealth funds to manage revenues for future generations. By asserting sovereignty over their natural resources, African nations can ensure that they are used to promote development and improve the welfare of their people rather than being siphoned off by foreign interests. Another aspect of fair partnerships in resource exploitation is the promotion of sustainable practices that minimize environmental damage and respect the rights of local communities. This includes conducting environmental impact assessments before approving resource projects, implementing measures to mitigate negative impacts on ecosystems and biodiversity, and consulting with affected communities to ensure their voices and concerns are heard. Senegal's new leadership has emphasized the importance of sustainable resource management as part of its broader agenda for environmental conservation and sustainable development. Furthermore, fair partnerships in resource exploitation require a commitment to inclusive and participatory decision-making processes that involve all stakeholders, including local communities, civil society organizations, and indigenous peoples. This includes ensuring that affected communities have access to information about resource projects and their potential impacts and opportunities to participate in decision-making processes that affect their lives and livelihoods. By empowering local communities to have a voice in resource governance, African nations can build trust and social cohesion and ensure that resource extraction benefits everyone, not just a select few. In addition to promoting fair partnerships in resource exploitation, African nations must diversify their economies and reduce their dependency on natural resource exports. This requires investment in agriculture, manufacturing, services, and policies promoting innovation, entrepreneurship, and skills development. By building a more resilient and diversified economy, African nations can reduce their vulnerability to commodity price fluctuations and create more sustainable and inclusive growth opportunities for their citizens. Ultimately, fair partnerships in resource exploitation are essential for promoting equitable development and reducing poverty and inequality in Africa. By asserting sovereignty over their natural resources, promoting sustainable practices, and involving all stakeholders in decision-making processes, African nations can ensure that resource extraction benefits everyone, not just a select few. As they continue to push for fair partnerships, African nations reclaim their rightful place as stewards of their destiny and shape the continent's future on their terms.